The night Peyton walked into the Sokolov event, she had already decided she wouldn't stay longer than 2 hours. That was the agreement she had made with herself on the cab ride over, watching the city blur past the window in streaks of amber and cold neon. 2 hours. Enough to show face, enough to satisfy the professional obligation, enough to collect whatever fragment of dignity remained in being the only independent contractor at a table full of people who operated by entirely different rules. Rules that were never written down anywhere, and yet everyone in those rooms seemed to know them by heart, everyone except her. She had been brought in through a consulting arrangement that her firm had negotiated without fully explaining the nature of the client. When the picture became clearer, she had already signed the confidentiality agreement, had already shaken hands, had already accepted the first wire transfer that arrived with the kind of quiet punctuality that felt more like a warning than a payment. Her work was legitimate. Logistics restructuring. Supply chain documentation. The kind of work that could exist in any corporation in the world, the kind of work that asked no questions and expected no answers about what, exactly, was being moved, or why certain routes were preferred over others, or why certain documentation was never to be filed in certain jurisdictions. She was good at her work. She had always been good at her work. That was, perhaps, the problem. The event was held in a private venue on the upper floor of a building that had no visible signage from the street. It was the kind of place that announced its own exclusivity through absence. No logo, no doorman in uniform, only a man in a dark suit who looked at her with the particular kind of assessment that measured not beauty but threat level, and then stepped aside. Inside, the lighting was low and deliberate. The music was the sophisticated kind that fills a room without demanding attention. Crystal caught light. Conversations happened in clusters, each one sealed like a private room within the larger room. Peyton moved through the space with the practiced ease of someone who had learned, early in life, that confidence was a costume that could be put on regardless of how the inside felt. She wore a deep burgundy dress that was elegant without being conspicuous, her natural hair pinned back with just enough looseness to suggest she hadn't tried too hard. Her earrings were gold. Simple. She carried nothing but a small clutch and the particular brand of self-possession that had gotten her through boardrooms and difficult negotiations and the specific kind of condescension that came from being one of the only women in a room, and one of the very few black women in most of the rooms she had ever occupied professionally. She spotted her contact, Vadim, a middle-aged man with a carefully neutral expression who served as the liaison between her firm and the Sokolov organization, near the bar, and made her way toward him with measured steps. What she did not do was look toward the far end of the room, where a man stood with his back partially to the space, speaking to 2 others in a way that suggested he was not hosting the evening so much as tolerating it. She would learn his name within the first 20 minutes. Damir Ruzanov. She would learn the weight of that name, what it meant in certain rooms, what silence fell around it, much more slowly. The first time their eyes met, it was an accident. Peyton had excused herself from Vadim's company after the requisite exchange of pleasantries and professional updates, and had drifted toward the window that looked out over the city. She needed a moment of quiet that wasn't actually quiet, the kind that exists at the edge of a crowded room, where you can be technically present while giving your mind a few seconds of uncrowded air. She was looking at the city when she felt the particular sensation of being observed with more than passing interest. She turned. He was across the room, perhaps 15 feet away, and he was not pretending he hadn't been looking. That was the first thing she noticed, the absence of the usual social performance of being caught. Most people, when their gaze is returned unexpectedly, redirect. They find something else to look at. They introduce a casual gesture that says, "I wasn't staring, I was simply thinking and my eyes happened to land here." He did none of that. He held her gaze with the kind of steadiness that was not aggression but was also not quite comfort. It was assessment. Unhurried, deliberate, the kind of look that said he was accustomed to reading rooms and reading people and had decided that she was worth the sustained attention of a second reading. Peyton did not look away either. This was not bravado. It was simply that she had spent enough of her professional life declining to perform smallness for other people's comfort, and she saw no reason to begin now, in a dress she had chosen carefully, in a city she had built her career in, at an event she had every right to attend. After a moment, it could have been 3 seconds, it could have been 10, someone spoke to him and his attention shifted. He turned and answered the question directed at him, and the thread between them dissolved as if it had never existed. Peyton turned back to the window. Her pulse was slightly elevated. She noted this the way she noted most things about herself, with clinical detachment, neither giving it weight nor dismissing it entirely. It was simply data. She stayed another hour and a half before Vadim found her again and introduced them properly. Damir Ruzanov, Vadim said, with a particular quality of care in his voice, the way someone introduces not just a name but an instruction about how to receive that name. He oversees the network coordination that interfaces most directly with your restructuring work. Damir Ruzanov extended his hand. He was tall in a way that was not remarkable until you were standing near it. His features were distinctly Eastern European, the kind of bone structure that aged with authority rather than against it. He was perhaps mid-40s, though something about him made age feel like a category that applied to other people. His suit was dark and impeccably fitted, and he wore it the way some people wear a second skin. There was nothing ostentatious about him. No visible jewelry except a single watch that she clocked as expensive in the particular way that expensive things sometimes announce themselves only to people who know what they're looking at. His expression, as he looked at her, was composed in a way that felt more like architecture than personality, a structure built and maintained by long practice. Miss Peyton. His voice was low, the accent present but measured, like someone who had spent years deciding exactly how much of his origin to keep and how much to set aside. Mr. Ruzanov, she said, and shook his hand with the firm directness she brought to every professional first contact. His grip was unhurried. Not possessive. Just present. I've reviewed the initial phase of your restructuring proposal, he said. It was thorough. Thank you. I had questions. I'd welcome them, she said, and meant it, because questions about her work were the domain where she felt most oriented, most herself, most clearly standing on ground that was entirely hers. Not tonight, he said. The faintest inflection in those two words, something that could be read as courtesy or as a quiet assertion that he set the terms of when and how things happened. There will be a more appropriate setting. She nodded once. Of course. He held her gaze for one beat longer than was strictly necessary, then redirected his attention to Vadim and the conversation moved on. Peyton stood in the arrangement of that exchange for a moment afterward, turning it over, looking at its edges. She had met powerful men before. She had worked with them, navigated around their assumptions, declined their condescension, earned their respect or didn't and moved forward either way. She was not easily unsettled. But there was something in the architecture of Damir Ruzanov that was different. Something she couldn't immediately name. It wasn't threat, exactly. It wasn't attraction, or not only that. It was more like the sensation of standing near something with significant gravitational pull, not being dragged, not falling, just being aware of the presence of a force that was doing something to the space around it. She filed this sensation. Noted it. Set it to one side. She left the event exactly 2 hours after she had arrived. The questions Damir Ruzanov mentioned came 3 days later, in a conference setting at a building in the financial district that looked, from the outside, like any number of legitimate holding companies. The meeting was structured. Professional. He arrived with 2 associates and reviewed her documentation with the kind of focused attention that told her, within the first 10 minutes, that he had read every page before arriving. She respected that. She did not find many people in these arrangements who had actually done the reading. He asked sharp questions. She gave precise answers. When he pushed back on a particular routing choice she had made, she did not retreat from her position. She explained it, methodically, with the supporting data behind it, and watched him process the information without revealing whether he was persuaded or still unconvinced. At the end of the meeting, after his associates had stepped out, he said, almost as a marginal note, "You don't adjust your position based on who is asking." "I adjust my position based on better information," she said. "The source doesn't affect the merit of the argument." Something shifted in his expression. Too small to be called a smile. More like a minor recalibration of whatever reading he had previously taken of her. "That's useful," he said. "I would hope so," she said. "It's why I was hired." She closed her laptop and began gathering her materials, and only noticed when she was almost finished that he had not yet moved to leave, was instead watching her with that particular quality of stillness she was beginning to recognize as characteristic of him. "Is there something else?" she asked, meeting his eyes directly. "No," he said. A pause. "Not yet." She did not ask what he meant. She knew better than to give ambiguity the satisfaction of being chaste. She said goodbye professionally and walked out and stood in the elevator and looked at her own reflection in the polished metal doors and thought, "Be careful." Not because she was afraid. Because she was starting not to be. The months that followed were characterized by a proximity that was entirely professional in structure and deeply complicated in feeling. Her restructuring work intersected with his oversight in regular intervals, meetings, reviews, documentation exchanges. She came to understand, gradually and through observation rather than any explicit disclosure, the dimensions of what Damir Ruzanov actually was in the organization he operated within. Not a frontman. Not a visible figure. He was the kind of power that functions precisely because it does not perform itself, the kind that is felt in outcomes rather than announced in statements. He made decisions that rearranged other people's circumstances without those people always understanding the origin of the rearrangement. She was careful not to know more than her work required. This was, she recognized, its own form of moral navigation, a constant, quiet calibration of what she participated in, what she enabled, what she could honestly say she did not know. She was not naive. She understood that legitimate and clean were not always the same category. She had understood this before she signed anything. But there was a difference between understanding something abstractly and living in its daily texture, and the daily texture required ongoing choices about where she stood and what she would carry. The work itself remained clean. She held to that. What became less clean was the inner weather. She noticed things. The way he listened, fully, without the fidgeting or glancing that marked most people's attention as partial. The way he spoke precisely, choosing words with the care of someone who had learned that language could be a liability if mishandled. The way he was in a room, not performing authority, just inhabiting it, which was somehow more disquieting than the performance would have been. She noticed that he was courteous to everyone who worked under him in a way that was not warmth but was not cruelty either, more like a particular form of respect that said, "I see what you do and I expect you to do it well," and that expectation itself is a form of regard. She noticed that he looked at her differently than he looked at other people. She did not examine this too closely. She simply noted it and set it in the part of her mind reserved for things that would need to be returned to eventually but were not available for full consideration right now. He, for his part, was meticulous in maintaining the professional frame. There were no inappropriate remarks. No gestures that overstepped. Nothing that could be pointed to and named. He treated her with the particular kind of professional seriousness that she had learned to value above most expressions of warmth, because it said, "I regard your competence as the primary fact about you in this context." And yet, there was the meeting where he had arrived before her and was standing at the window and turned when she entered, and the expression on his face in the half-second before he arranged it into neutral professionalism was something she caught and stored like a pressed flower, fragile, slightly inexplicable, kept somewhere private. There was the evening when a call ran long and they ended up standing in a corridor together waiting for a car, and the silence between them had a texture to it that she could only describe as inhabited, not empty, not uncomfortable, but full of something unspoken that both of them were, with full awareness, declining to name. There was the moment when she had pushed back hard in a meeting, harder than usual, on a proposal she found ethically dubious in ways she could not be fully explicit about, and he had listened to her without interruption and then, after a long pause, said, "Table it," to the room. No explanation. Just that. And she had not thanked him for it and he had not looked at her like he expected thanks, and somehow the absence of that exchange said more than either one of them spoke out loud. She was being careful. She was also, she admitted to herself in the quiet of her own apartment on certain evenings, losing ground. The night everything shifted was not the night she might have predicted. There was a function, not dissimilar from the first event where they had met, but larger, and with a different social current to it. A gathering that served multiple purposes simultaneously, as such events always do in environments where everything has multiple purposes. Peyton was present professionally. She had been asked to attend to facilitate introductions with a European contact that her work had made necessary. She was standing in conversation with two people she had been introduced to earlier in the evening, holding a glass of sparkling water, engaged in the kind of surface-level professional exchange that required approximately 15% of her attention while the rest of her remained available and watchful, when she became aware of another presence entering her immediate space. A man she didn't know. Mid-40s. Well-dressed in the way that people who want to signal wealth without having fully earned access to real power dress. He had been watching her, she understood from the quality of his approach, for some time. He joined the conversation without being invited to, which she noted but did not react to. He inserted himself smoothly, the way men who have long been permitted to insert themselves into women's spaces do, not aggressively, just with the default assumption that his presence was welcome. She remained polite. Poised. Continued the conversation. And then, mid-exchange, his hand moved to her waist. Not aggressively. Not violently. Just that particular brand of presumption that presents itself as casual, as comfortable, as though the boundary being crossed was not a boundary at all but simply available space. Peyton stepped smoothly to the side, away from the contact, with the kind of clean efficiency that said, no, and said it without drama, without escalation, without the performance of distress that such moments sometimes seem to require from women to be taken seriously. She had done this before. She knew exactly how to remove herself from unwanted physical contact without creating a scene that would cost her more than it cost the person who had created the need for it. She said something measured and redirected the conversation. And then the music stopped. Not metaphorically. The music in the room, that sophisticated, unobtrusive background score that had been running all evening, stopped. Completely. And the particular silence that follows unexpected silence in a room full of people fell over the gathering like a dropped cloth. In that silence, she was aware of a shift in the room's attention. The way a room's collective gaze redirects. She looked up. Damir Ruzanov was standing perhaps 12 feet away, and his attention was fixed not on her but on the man who had placed his hand on her waist. He was not moving. He was not speaking. He was simply standing there, holding the man in the particular kind of regard that Peyton could feel from across the room as a kind of atmospheric pressure. He did not raise his voice. He did not make a gesture. He simply looked. The man who had touched her understood something. Peyton could see it happen, a visible recalibration in his posture, a tightening, a recognition of something in Damir's stillness that communicated, without any explicit statement, that what had just happened was not acceptable and would not be occurring again. The man made some kind of social noise, an excuse, a redirect, and removed himself from the conversation with the particular haste of someone who has realized they misread the room badly. The music resumed. Conversation picked back up around the room. Damir's eyes moved from the retreating figure to Peyton. For a moment, they simply looked at each other across the space between them. She felt something in her chest that she had no interest in naming right now in a crowded room. She felt also, simultaneously, the impulse to resist whatever this moment was suggesting, the instinct to be careful about what it meant that he had noticed, what it meant that he had responded, what story she was now implicated in simply by being the person it had happened to. She gave him a single, composed nod. He returned it. That was all. She found him on the terrace later, and she was not fully certain whether she had sought it or allowed it. The distinction, she thought, mattered. He was standing alone, looking out at the city with the particular quality of his stillness, and when she came to stand beside him, he didn't perform surprise. He simply made room. For a while, neither of them spoke. You didn't need to do that, she said eventually. I know, he said. I had it handled. I know that too. She looked at him. Then why? He was quiet for a moment. The city below them hummed with its usual indifference. Because I could, he said. And then, more quietly, and because it mattered to me that it stopped. She took that in. Turned it carefully. That's a meaningful distinction, she said. Yes, he said. It is. Another silence. The kind they had built a fluency in, over months of careful professional distance. The kind that held things without forcing them. This is complicated, she said. Everything worth anything is. She looked at him again. His profile against the city lights. The contained quality of him. The thing that she had felt from the beginning, that gravitational pull, that sense of force operating quietly, without announcement. I don't do things that compromise my clarity, she said. Not as a warning. As information. As the kind of honesty she offered at significant moments to significant people. He turned to look at her fully, and in the ambient light of the city, she saw something in his expression that she had not quite seen before. Not the composed professional architecture. Not the deliberate neutrality. Something underneath it, not weakness exactly, but the particular vulnerability that exists in someone who has spent years being entirely controlled and is finding, in this moment, that control harder than usual to maintain. I don't ask you to, he said. His voice was different in this register. Quieter. More careful. I wouldn't. She believed him. She was not certain she should, but she did. I'm going to think about this, she said. I'd expect nothing else, he said. She looked out at the city for another moment, and then she went back inside, and she did not look back, and he did not call after her. The weeks that followed were a different kind of complicated. Nothing explicit had been declared. No lines had been crossed. And yet something had been named, in the way things can be named without words, through the specific quality of a shared terrace and an honest exchange and the way two people can decide, silently, together, that a thing exists between them even as neither of them is yet certain what to do with it. Their professional interactions continued. She would not have allowed them to be otherwise. Her work remained the clear, defined domain that it had always been, and she brought the same precision and integrity to it that she had brought from the beginning. She refused, consciously, to let the personal weather affect the professional structure. He seemed to understand and respect this. He did not test it. But there were small things. The way he positioned himself at meetings now, slightly, incrementally, as someone who was more interested in facing her direction than any other direction. A message sent one evening, not about work, just 3 sentences, saying that he had read something that had reminded him of an argument she had made in one of their early meetings, and that she had been right and he had been wrong about the routing, in retrospect. It was such a precise thing to say. Such a deliberate thing. An acknowledgement that was also an offering. She sat with it for a long time before she replied, simply, briefly, I know. But thank you for saying it. She thought about what she was doing. She thought about it honestly, the way she tried to think about most things, with full acknowledgement of complication, without the comfort of simplifying narratives. She was a professional woman building a serious career, and she was developing feelings for a man who operated at the intersection of legitimate business and things that did not bear close examination. She was doing this with open eyes. She was not being rescued. She was not being swept away. She was making choices, and the choices had costs that she was counting. She thought about her own integrity. About the lines she had drawn and would not redraw. About who she was and what she carried with her through the world, and how much of that identity she was willing to compromise or complicate or risk. She thought about him. The listening. The precision. The way he had stood at the edge of a room and made something stop simply by the quality of his attention. The way he had said it mattered to me that it stopped, and what that sentence contained, not possession, not entitlement, but something rawer and less easily managed than either of those. She thought about the fact that she had never once, in all of this, felt diminished by him. That was not a small thing. That was, in her experience, not a guaranteed thing. There came an evening when she had worked late and the building was almost empty, and she ran into him in the corridor by accident. No meeting scheduled, no professional purpose for the proximity. He was coming from a conversation that she could see from his expression had been a draining one. He looked, for a moment, before he registered that it was her, simply tired. Simply human. The architecture of his control was still present, but there was something honest beneath it, not hidden but not usually visible, and she saw it in the 3 seconds before he gathered himself back into the version she usually encountered. She didn't pretend she hadn't seen it. Long day, she said. Neutral. offering him the space to take or leave the openness as he chose. They all are, he said. She leaned against the wall beside the elevator door. He stopped. Neither of them moved to summon the elevator. Are you all right? She asked. He looked at her with an expression she couldn't fully parse, something between surprise and something more careful, like he was registering, for the first time, that someone had asked without any strategy behind the asking. Just the question, clean and direct. I manage, he said. That's not what I asked. A pause. Something passed through his expression. No, he said quietly. I'm not always. She nodded once. Okay, she said. And she didn't push further, didn't offer comfort he hadn't asked for, didn't fill the moment with reassurance that would have been about her discomfort with his honesty rather than his actual need. Just, okay. I hear you. He looked at her for a long moment. You're a very unusual person, he said. I've been told, she said. And the corner of his mouth, just the corner, just barely, moved. The smallest possible gesture towards something warmer. Gone almost before it arrived. The elevator came. They rode down together in silence, and at the lobby she said goodnight and he said goodnight and they walked in different directions into the cold city air. She walked 3 blocks before she let herself feel the full weight of what she was carrying. There was a night, much later, when she came to a decision. Not a dramatic one. Not one that announced itself with certainty. More like the kind of decision that arrives after a long and honest internal negotiation, when all the arguments have been made and heard and the person is left simply with the truth of what they want and what they're willing to pay for it. She sent him a message. Not about work. She said, I think we should talk. Not about the restructuring. His response came 40 minutes later, I know. When? She said, Saturday. Somewhere quiet. He said, yes. That was all. She sat in her apartment afterward and felt the weight of it, not fear, exactly. More like the sensation of standing at an edge and having decided, consciously, to take the next step. Not being pushed. Not falling. Choosing. She was not naive about what she was walking toward. She knew the complications. She knew the costs. She knew that proximity to someone like Damir Rozanov was not a neutral thing, that it would ask things of her that she could not fully anticipate, that it would require an ongoing vigilance about her own values and her own lines that would not always be comfortable. She also knew that she had spent a long time being careful in ways that were sometimes indistinguishable from being afraid. And she knew that when he had said it mattered to me that it stopped, she had recognized something in those words, not a claim on her, but a truth being stated with the specific vulnerability of someone who had not meant to let it be visible. Saturday came. They met at a small restaurant that was quiet in the particular way that quality places are quiet, not empty but unobtrusive, each table its own contained world. He was there when she arrived, which she noticed. They talked. Not about work. Not about the organization. Not about all the complicated geography that surrounded them like weather. They talked with the particular quality that careful people sometimes finally achieve when they have decided to lay down the armor for a measured hour, not carelessly, not naively, but with the specific intention of being honest. She told him about the work she had done before this, the career she had built, the things she had sacrificed for it and the things she would not sacrifice. She told him about the line she kept returning to in her own internal accounting, the line between what was complicated. In the weeks that followed, she would think about what she had chosen and continue choosing it, and continue also to hold the cost of it clearly in view, because she was a person who believed that things were only truly chosen when they were chosen with full awareness of what they asked for. The work continued. The complication continued. The careful, real thing between them continued, slowly, honestly, without the fast heat that burns and leaves nothing. She was not saved. She was not swept away. She was a person, standing in her own life, in the full complexity of it, deciding each day what she would carry and what she would set down and what she would, carefully, choose. And that, she thought, was as close to solid ground as any of them ever really got. Hey, my loves. If you made it to the end of this one, thank you. Genuinely. That means something to me. I wrote this story because I wanted to give you something that felt real. Not a fantasy, not a fairy tale, but a kind of love story that breathes the way real things breathe. Messy and careful and slow and honest. The kind where nobody rescues anybody, and both people are just trying to figure out how to be truthful with each other in the middle of lives that are already complicated. Peyton isn't perfect. Demir isn't redeemable in a neat storybook way. But they see each other. And I think that's one of the most human things there is, to be truly seen by someone, in all your contradiction, and not have them look away. That moment when the music stopped. I hope you felt it the way I felt it when I wrote it. Not because he swooped in and saved her, she didn't need saving, and she knew it, but because something in him cared enough to make the room acknowledge that she mattered. Tell me in the comments, what moment hit you the hardest? I want to know. I read every single one. And if you're new here, welcome, you found the good corner of the internet. I hope you stay a while.